So, if your biggest source of overwhelm is actually other people and their demands on your time, external things that you can't control pressing on you, is there any hope? That's what we're going to talk about today. And this is a topic we're returning to. You'll note this topic is Overcoming Overwhelm Part 2, because the first time we talked about this, and I shared frameworks around how you can really work on your own psychology around feelings of overwhelm. Lots of folks said, hey, wait a minute, but what about all the stuff that happens that's outside of me and my stuff? Other people's expectations and demands. And that's what's really pressing on me and creating this overwhelm. So what do we do about that? Well, that's what we're going to explore today. And just to remind everyone, the reason we're having this conversation is that so many of us who are doing this work, who feel called to contribute to something larger than ourselves, to make the world a better place, we just find ourselves in this pattern of running in the red zone, of pushing so hard that we really have the risk of burning out. And, as we all know, burning out is not a badge of honor, especially if the consequence of that is actually less impact out in the world, not to mention less joy for yourself. So we talked about understanding overwhelm in psychological terms using this model we use a lot around cognitive behavioral psychology, thoughts, feelings, and actions as the three things that determine your state of mind. And when you're feeling overwhelmed, you often get caught in this loop between thoughts and feelings where you're not really taking action. That's in some ways why it's overwhelming. You're just feeling bad and you think there's nothing you can do about it. It's easy to get stuck there. And breaking out of that loop is really just about shifting one of those things. Very often, the easiest thing to shift is your thoughts or your actions. It can be hard to shift feelings directly. And that's one of the insights of cognitive behavioral therapy that, if you want to change how you're feeling, then focus on your thoughts and your actions, not so much your feelings, and you'll see that your feelings shift automatically. So we talked about two tools last time, this idea of finding your pace of grace. And, one of the issues is like, how do you find your pace of grace if other people are impinging on you? But, focusing on the problem that you feel called to solve only enough so that it stokes your energy, not takes it away. Focusing on practical progress, right? One thing that's key in having a sense of momentum is just, getting that little bit of clarity and planning that gives you tools and clarity about what you actually need to do to make progress, because making progress changes how you feel. And if you feel called to go faster, treat yourself like an endurance athlete. Taking care of the fundamentals of exercise, sleep, nutrition are key to sustaining what you're doing. Comparisons to other people are not productive. And then experiment, evaluate, appreciate. Really approach this with an innovative mind and flexibility to figure out what kind of routines are really sustainable for you for the long run. We talked about this idea of 5 to thrive, that you want to sort of pick a list of things that are already working for you to overcome overwhelm, and then make that kind of your go-to toolkit so that no matter what the situation, you have at least one tool that works for you to kind of calm yourself down, reset, and stay focused. So that's what we talked about last time. And you can see from this list why, you might be feeling like, hey, wait a minute. If my real source of overwhelm here is situations, systems, dynamics that are outside of my control, the 5 to thrive might help me. My pace of grace, that's great. But, for a lot of us, it might really feel like we don't have the space to implement our own pace of grace. And if you're feeling like, that idea of a pace of grace is like, that's nice, but that's not realistic for you. There aren't magic answers here, but we want to bring in the tools of systems thinking to really understand what is going on when you're interacting with other people, or when you're in your organizational setting, when you're showing up as a leader. Why is it that you are continuously getting into situations where you feel overwhelmed? Because chances are, if you've done your best efforts to change something and it keeps happening, there's a larger system at work that is kind of in some sort of stable equilibrium. And until you figure out how to disrupt that system, to really engage in systems change, you're likely going to be stuck. And these things we just talked about, the 5 to thrive, your pace of grace, they are maybe treating the symptoms, but not really getting to the root cause of your overwhelm. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to try to diagnose the root cause of why you may be feeling overwhelmed. So a quick systems thinking primer. Systems thinking has been around it's been around a long time, probably going back thousands of years, but it's been called systems thinking for about 25, 30 years. Peter Senge in the early 90s, did a lot of work here, that pioneering in the field. And there's a great book by Donatella Meadows called Thinking in Systems, which lays out sort of three simple ideas about what is a system and what is systems thinking. That really there are three things that go into any system. There are the components, the pieces of the system. There are the interconnections, the way the pieces are tied together. And then there are the outputs, which are the things that the system consistently produces. No matter what people say its actual purpose is, you understand a system in terms of what it actually does. And systems thinking can be very powerful when you're not getting the result that you hope, right? Because there's complexity involved. You sort of you have intentions, or other people have intentions, but somehow you keep ending up with a result that is not the outcome you want. That's a good indicator to go back and look at, how does this system work? So if you're feeling overwhelmed on a consistent basis, if you're regularly feeling overwhelmed, running in that red zone, and you've already thought about my 5 to Thrive, you've thought about what is my pace of grace, and you're still feeling like, hey, I keep finding myself in this situation which is overwhelming, it can be a great cue to really break down and look at the system that is producing that, right? And we can think about components, their interrelationships, and then the outcomes. So, for example, the components of a system, just to keep it very simple, might be you and your boss, whether that's a board of directors, whether it's a chair of a board, whether you're running a business, it might be shareholders. I mean, whatever your situation, most of us, even those of us who are entrepreneurs, we might have investors, we might have other people that we're accountable to. So there's you, someone you're accountable to, and some kind of deadline or high stakes decision. Those are three components in a system that very often might produce overwhelm, depending how they're put together. So that's the next piece. How are these components wired together? This is where it can be really helpful to think about power dynamics, roles, relationships. And just for example, let's say we're talking about your system for producing overwhelm. And you want to think about, and for me, for example, like if I felt overwhelmed in a client relationship with someone I was advising or some institution I was advising on a regular basis, I found myself continuously feeling like, this is so much, I'm getting stressed out. It's a good indication to step back and say, okay, what are the component parts? And then what are the relationship between them? And in this case, you could think of the relationship you have with your boss, your client, your board chair, whoever that person is that's involved in those high stakes decisions. Are you the hired help? Are you kind of hired to just paint between the lines under continuous supervision, right? That's one role that you might be playing. Are you the faithful steward? Are you sort of responsible for making sure the paint goes between the lines, even when whoever has authority is not looking, right? Are you a trusted advisor? Are you responsible for actually figuring out, maybe we should paint outside the lines of your comfort zone, to the board or whomever you're dealing with, especially if that's going to produce more impact. So it's your responsibility to kind of communicate that, even when that's not what other people want to hear. Are you a delegated decision maker? Have you been entrusted with whole arenas of authority where it's your job to figure out what to do, how to do it, make sure it gets done? And maybe you need to inform some people along the way or consult with them before you make a decision. So understanding what the relationship actually is that you're dealing with can be really important, because very often overwhelm comes in when you wish you were operating in a different kind of relationship with somebody. And you don't actually have the level of autonomy that you think you need in order to operate successfully. And this is, we find all the time that, very often people in authority think that they are treating people sort of one level higher up than they actually are in a system like this. And so you might feel like, hey, my job is to be a delegated decision maker, but I'm actually being treated more like a faithful steward, or I'm kind of like an advisor. I'm not even really getting to make this decision, even though I thought I was supposed to be. So that can be a big source of stress and overwhelm if there's a lack of role clarity or a misunderstanding about what your level of responsibility actually is, or you simply feel you don't have sufficient responsibility to make decisions in a way that is efficient, effective, and actually going to produce impact. So the last piece you want to look at when you're mapping your own system of overwhelm is, what's the consequence of these components and the way they're tied together? What are the outcomes that this system is producing when it comes to making high stakes decisions? What's actually happening, regardless of what people's intentions are? And this is where you may find, for example, that an organization's board meetings are not, they're more like producing burnout than breakthroughs. They're not actually really producing powerful governance. But the process of the board meeting is leading decisions to, it's so cumbersome that high stakes decisions are getting made somewhere else. You, as the person responsible for kind of, when I was leading a nonprofit, typical responsibility of an executive director is to organize a board meeting. You may talk to your board chair, but then you sort of produce a lot of material for that board. And then very often the board doesn't even engage with that material. But you spent all this time producing it. So you're feeling burned out, the board is not engaged, and decisions are happening somewhere else. That's not the outcome that anyone says they intended from this particular system. And yet that's the outcome that it's consistently producing. So if you map that system, now you have a little more leverage to think about, well, how do we want to change it? And the idea here is that leverage for changing a system actually increases at each level that you go up. It's very hard sometimes to change the components in a system. So you might go to your board and say, you know what, these board meetings are really a bummer. Can we not have board meetings? They're going to say, no, we have to have board meetings. We can't take the high stakes thing away. And you don't probably even really want to do that, right? You also aren't going to remove the board or yourself. So the components often in a system are more fixed than many other things. The interconnections or relationships, there may be leverage there. You may be able to redefine how you relate to the board or whoever it is that you're finding that relationship is not working well. So there are lots of opportunities there. But perhaps even the most powerful form of leverage when you're trying to change a system like this is the perception of the system, your own perception of it and the perception of other key stakeholders. Because very often people don't actually go through that whole process of analysis to realize, like, hey, what we intend here, the outcomes we intend, are not the outcomes that we're actually producing. And that, if you can show that gap between what's real and what's ideal, all of a sudden you may have real leverage to shift people's mindset and to actually engage them constructively with you in redesigning the system so that it has more likelihood of producing the positive benefits that you're going for without the kind of negative downsides. Like, nobody intended for you to feel burnt out, but if you keep feeling burnt out every time you have a board meeting, and you have 6 board meetings a year, that's not a recipe for joyful impact for you or for the organization. So we got a lot of resources on this through the blog, through the members area. I just went back and looked at a bunch of things we put together. There's one on root cause analysis. So if you were actually looking to really deconstruct a system, this is a great tool for doing that. And really getting, asking yourself 5 whys, really breaking down the components of a system and their relationship to understand, why are we getting this outcome that maybe we don't intend. Deep listening, got a whole piece on that around, once you've figured out how a system works, or even before you have, engaging the other people in deep listening, really starting by trying to understand their perspective, their needs, using frameworks of human needs psychology and otherwise to understand where they're coming from, can be transformational. Collaborative problem solving. This is a tool that, okay, we've done some deep listening. Now we know what the different interests are that are on the table. Let's try to solve for this in a way that isn't zero sum, that actually creates a solution that maybe none of us had thought of before we sat down to think about it. Interpersonal dynamics, lots of power issues. If you really want to unpack the relationships within a system that's burning you out on a continuous basis, that's a great one to check out. And then this piece is really around how you maximize your positive influence on other people in the context of those interpersonal relationships. So just a few examples of ideas that you can explore if you are finding that your biggest source of overwhelm is actually how other people are sort of pressing on you or engaging you, and you want to dig in and look at that at a systems level. Last thing I'm going to say is we talk all the time about these 5 stages of personal development, all the way from infantile up to self-transcending, increasingly having sort of a broader sense of yourself and a perspective on what's going on around you. And we talked about how these lower levels of infantile, externally directed, internally directed, are powered by fear. And these 2 higher levels are powered by joy. And in this journey of joyful impact, part of what we're trying to do is elevate our own consciousness so that we are coming from a place of joy rather than a place of fear as we go through our lives. That's part of what this idea of systems thinking, the idea is that you can see the system much better when you get up to these higher levels. And to play that out and thinking about your leverage for systems change, to map across, what level of kind of personal development or consciousness corresponds with different levers for systems change. Well, the first thing to say is that if you're down here at this infantile level where you're just focused on meeting your own needs, you're not even going to see the system at all. You only see it if it gets in your way. And you don't care about changing it, you just want what you want. And then if you're looking to other people for approval, if you're at the externally directed stage, you may see the system, but you're really probably fearful about making waves to change it. So you don't have much leverage to change a system when you are exclusively coming from an externally directed perspective. I should also say that we all move up and down the spectrum continuously. So it's not that someone is locked into one level. It's just what level are you coming from when you try to engage in systems change. The next level up, when you're internally directed, you're all about your own plan. That's often when you see kind of people who go really hardcore trying to change the components of the system, because that's the part that's most visible in a way, and it's also the hardest part to change. So people get frustrated. This happens in philanthropy all the time when people come in with big plans for systems change and they want people to enroll in their plan, and then they end up just beating their head against a wall and getting frustrated because they're not actually engaging in the places in the system where there's the greatest leverage. So next up is that self-evolving stage of consciousness, if you will, where you're really thinking about your own self and your own growth and sort of making your psychology larger. And that's where you might focus on shifting relationships. You have a lot of leverage to positively influence other people when you can rise to that level yourself. And then lastly, when you really transcend yourself, you are at your greatest capability as a change agent in a system. You can perceive that whole system and understand that the power of perception is incredibly profound in changing systems. And that rather than trying to change the components of the system or even the way people relate, if you can change the way people understand what the system is actually doing and what we want it to do and the difference between the two, that mindset shift on the part of the people who are stakeholders in the system can be the most powerful thing that you can get leverage on. So I hope that's helpful as you think about overcoming overwhelm in your pursuit of joy and impact. If you like this video and you want to access the worksheet or any other material that goes with it, just click the link below or head on over to joyfulimpact.co. That's the website where we have all the material we use for working with coaching and personal development for change agents. You can set up a free account in the members area, and you can also check out the blog where we have new content coming out all the time. Why are we putting all this out there for free? Because the world has never been more in need of a new greatest generation of change agents. I hope this material is helpful to you, and if it is, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. That will help us spread the word.